One evening in late October 1971, enigmatic singer-songwriter Nick Drake made a phone call from his home in Muswell Hill to one of the few people in the world he trusted, John Wood. Wood was the founder and engineer at Sound Techniques, a studio in Chelsea long associated with Nick and his contemporaries, people like John Martyn and Fairport Convention. John had served as engineer on Nick's first two records in the previous few years, yet had barely heard from the famously aloof yet boundlessly talented musician. Picking up the phone in Suffolk, John listened as Nick made his simple request to record his new album. Anyone who knew Nick Drake knew that he was notoriously hard to pin down, so wanting to strike while the iron was hot, John booked him into Sound Techniques for the very next week. The studio was fully booked, but this didn't matter for John, who carved out space for Nick to have 2 sessions, each beginning at 11 PM and each 3 hours. The result of those 6 hours, plus a couple more to mix and sort out the order of tracks, resulted in one of the most critically acclaimed, intimate and genius works of music ever put to tape, and the last full project of its young and promising creator, Pink Moon. Pink Moon has been one of my favourite albums for a long time, but I've been especially into Nick Drake in the past year or so, and so I wanted to make a video dissecting the entire album, the process of its creation, the guitar playing, and the music theory behind it. This video is going to go through every single song on the album, so you can use the timestamps in the description or the timeline if there's any songs that interest you in particular. This video is also very focused on Pink Moon specifically and the late 1970 to early 1972 period of Nick Drake's life and career, and so I'm not going to go into any detail about, say, his early life or his other 2 albums. If you're interested in Nick Drake, I cannot recommend Richard Morton Jack's 2022 biography, Nick Drake: The Life, enough. It's where I got most of the biographical data from Nick, and is by far the best biography of him. If reading a whole book's a little much, there's a couple of really good YouTube videos covering his career, especially one by Volksgeist, or the 2002 documentary A Skin Too Few, which is available online in lots of different places. Let's first talk about the opening and title track of the record, Pink Moon. One of 2 strummed songs on the album, Nick strums the guitar with his fingernails, never using a plectrum. And as with most of the record, it's very basic in its instrumentation, harmony and melody, basically only using the 1, 4 and 5 chord with some suspensions around and moments of the 2 chord. I saw it written and I saw it say. The greatest complexity in the song, as is the case with much of the album, is in the interaction between the guitar rhythms and Nick's singing. Here, the melody starts just a hair after beat 2. As pointed out by music writer Amanda Petrosic, Nick seems to struggle with the lower end of the melody, with some parts of the vocal track being virtually inaudible when he sings those lowest notes. He sings here lower than he normally ever goes in his songs. Bing, 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 bing. Bing. John Wood was surprised when Nick told him that he didn't want any other instruments on the record, apart from one little piano moment on the song. The short piano solo is the only moment of anything other than Nick and his guitar on the album, and it works completely perfectly. Using Sound Techniques' Steinway B grand piano from the 1930s, the same piano used on Nick's other records, it comes in a short 8-bar interlude going D, E minor 9, G5 over D, and then plaguily resolving to D. It's a very simple, mostly stepwise melody that fits with the pastoral, simple nature of the whole record. The song is in the Nick Drake tuning, with a capo on the 2nd fret to put the song in D major. I'm going to be talking about guitar tunings a lot in this video, and that's because they're basically the key to Nick's whole sound. The vast majority of his songs are written in alternate tunings, and fairly uncommon alternate tunings at that. A guitar, in standard, is tuned to E, A, D, G, B, E. In fourths, apart from the G to B. But in several styles of guitar playing, like the blues and folk that Nick was well acquainted with, alternate tunings are a staple. The most popular of these are either drop tunings, where the lowest string is dropped to a lower note, most commonly a D, or open tunings, where strumming the unfretted strings yields a full chord. The most common of these are E, D and G, and were frequently used by Nick's contemporaries. Some more interesting tunings are also pretty popular, especially D-A-D-G-A-D, or Dadgad, and these are the tunings that most in Nick's world stuck to. On John Martyn's 1973 record Solid Air, he uses standard tuning, open D, drop D, Dadgad, and in only one instance does he experiment with more adventurous tunings. This instance is on the title track, which uses C, G, E flat, F, B flat, D. But this song is actually a tribute to Nick Drake, who at the time was in the depths of his mental illness. So it's no surprise that John Martyn would use a Nick Drake-esque tuning.
I know you, I love you, I'll be your friend.
The tuning most associated with Nick, and now referred to as the Nick Drake tuning, is an open C add 11, or C add 4, depending on how you see it, going C, G, C, F, C, E, and is heard on 3 songs on Pink Moon, including this title track. Having that F tucked away in the C chord makes the tuning ripe for suspensions and interesting chord voices, something which Nick exploits to its fullest on this record. Several critics have pointed out Nick's enunciation on the track, which is odd, to say the least. He slurs his words in places. Listen to how he says, "I saw it written and I saw it say."
Saw it written and I saw it say.
Petricic sees this as a sign of desperation and depression, Nick not being able to squeeze out the words he wants to. And Richard Morton Jack sees it as blending in the archaic to the record, saying ye instead of you. But I think Trevor Dan provides a more satisfying explanation. He links it to John Martyn, who I mentioned earlier when talking about tunings. John Martyn crops up a few times in this video, so I'll explain a little about him. He was a similar musician to Nick, a highly skilled acoustic guitarist, signed to the same record label and working in the same London folk music scene. Personality-wise, however, they couldn't have been more different. The rough and ready Glaswegian John Martyn had a background as far removed from the public schooling of Nick that one could find. But the two of them got along well. As I said, John's 1973 song Solid Air is a tribute to Nick, and I'd suggest any fan of Nick Drake go and listen to that song and the whole album because it's just fantastic. Anyway, John Martyn's unique style of singing saw him often slurring his words in a similar manner. Listen to how he pronounces solid on this 1978 performance of Solid Air, really emphasising that z rather than s sound, voicing while making the sibilants.
Painted and blue, living on solid air.
Lyrically, like much of the record, Pink Moon conceals itself and has rather impressionistic lyrics. Richard Morton Jack calls Nick a prophet of doom on the track, hailing the oncoming pink moon. The pink moon is April's full moon in the Northern Hemisphere, which, as of writing, I've only missed by a couple of days. It's not actually pink, but a reference to the pinkness of springtime as flowers begin to blossom. All the songs on the album are endlessly interpreted, and no one answer will get you any closer to an objective truth. But the title track seems to touch on death and rebirth, and a sense of comfort and inevitability in the end, recurring themes on the album, as we'll see. Nick's depression has been mentioned so far, but it's something worth addressing in further detail since it dominates discussion of the album so much. It's certainly a very sad album, yet it's reductive to examine every single thing through the lens of depression. Nick was always shy, but those who knew him well saw a very sharp and sudden decline towards the end of 1970, rather than, say, a slow decline over many years. 2 songs on Pink Moon, Parasite and Things Behind the Sun, predate Nick's mental collapse, and therefore it's something of an anachronism to view them entirely through this lens. Things like viewing Nick's singing style on this first song as a symptom of his mental state, to me, are stretches. None of this is to call it a happy album or anything, but it's worth pushing back a little on overemphasising Nick's depression as the sole influence on Pink Moon. He still was one of the country's best singer-songwriters after all. At the same time, as Petricic points out, no matter how hard we try to eschew the cult of Drake, to divorce his art from his disease, it is pervasive, omnipresent. It is the monster in the corner, the inevitable epilogue, the truth that can't be drowned out, no matter how loud we turn up the stereo.
When I was young, younger than before.
The second song, Place to Be, is one of the more unique songs on the album. After the opener, it's the only other strummed song on the whole record, and the way the album is structured gives the record a starting energy with the strumming that depletes after these 5 songs, and especially after the 5th track, Horn. Being in 3/4, it's the only song on the record to not be in 4/4 time, depending on how you count Parasite, and has a totally unique tuning. It's a variation of the Nick Drake tuning, with the second string tuned all the way down to a G, giving a tuning of C, G, C, F, G, E. This is the only time Nick ever used this highly unique tuning, which has a similar suspended feel to the normal Nick Drake tuning, but with a major sixth difference between the first and second string, and just a major second difference between the second and third string. Because of the proximity between the second and third strings, this song creates some really stunning cluster chords in the F add 11, with the A, B flat and C all rubbing up right next to each other. The song mostly alternates between F and G minor, with some added 11ths and other little changes dotted in. As with a lot of the songs, the tuning really forms the basis of the music, and has a single note that sits atop the whole piece. In this case, a fairly high A. Nick has his capo on the 4th fret here, the highest of anywhere on the album. Lyrically, the song shows Nick confronting his own perceived failures. The final verse contains at least one reference to his past work, mentioning When the Day Was Done, a reference to Day Is Done from 5 Leaves Left, his debut album.
When the day is done, down to earth and sinks the sun.
That song touches on the unstoppable passage of time that he increasingly felt was slipping away from him. Combined with the reference to being strong in the sun, this could also be a reference to his song Saturday Sun, which talks of Saturday's sun turning into rain as Sunday dawns.
But Saturday sun.
He has perhaps lost the ability to feel things will get better for him here. Nick once told his mother that he had failed at everything that he ever attempted to do in his life, and he seems to refer to that here when he defines himself as weaker than the palest blue.
You can take a road that takes you to the stars, now I can take a road that...
Critics have noted the complexity of his guitar work in Road, which features arguably the most intricate fingerpicking on a record dense with the style. The tuning and the fingerpicking pattern are deeply interwoven in this song, so I'll explain the tuning and then get back to the fingerpicking. The song is tuned in nearly standard tuning, except with the G string dropped down to an E. With a capo on the 2nd fret, this gives a tuning of F sharp, B, E, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp. This tuning is pretty rare even for Nick, who would only use it on this song and a later one titled Voice from the Mountain, which he recorded in his fairly fruitless final recording sessions, post Pink Moon.
Voice from the mountain and a voice from the sea.
Having 3 F sharps in the tuning ties it really strongly to this note, especially since the top 3 strings are never fretted in the song, giving an F sharp 5 chord at the top pretty much throughout, whilst the harmony in both the voice and the rest of the guitar can shift around underneath. It almost sounds like 2 guitars, one playing the melody in a lower register, whilst another plays this high ostinato. Scott Apple argues that the song reverses the function of the thumb and fingers, giving the thumb a rhythmic responsibility that most folk guitar pieces never do, contenting themselves with just a basic tonic dominant bass pattern. The harmony kind of unravels itself in the first few bars of the song. It opens with F sharps, C sharps and E naturals, not exactly revealing what kind of F sharp we're going to get. In bar 3 we hear D sharp, pulling us perhaps towards a Dorian sound rather than a purely F sharp minor one. But this is until bar 5 when we hear the A sharp, leaving us firmly in F sharp mixolydian, where the song remains. There's also another couple of interesting rhythmic moments in the song, such as a couple of extra beats in the introduction and some crotchet triplets that break up the guitar part. Probably owing to the complexity of the guitar part, the vocal melody is quite simple, with some bars just full of quavers singing one note.
You can say the sun is shining if you really want to. I can see the moon and it seems so clear.
The vocal melody also largely follows the lead of the guitar here, unlike some of the songs on Pink Moon where the challenge comes in singing and playing simultaneously, like in the title track and Parasite. The lyrics are often interpreted as being suicidal ideation, talking about a road that will see him through. This is probably on the right track, though Martyn Jack has raised the possibility of this song also being inspired by one of his mother's songs, The Road to the Stars.
There's a road to the stars, but I don't know the way.
Which I think is almost certainly true with some undeniable parallels. In that song, his mother says that there's a road to the stars, but I don't know the way. We could go to the stars if you would show me the way.
You can take a road that takes you to the stars, now I can take a road that'll see me through.
There's a few things Nick could be saying here. That he can walk his own path rather than go with other people's expectations or methods, or that he's no longer aiming for the stars, but rather desperately trying to grasp at anything within his reach. Nick in this period was growing increasingly desperate to find some kind of solution to his mounting mental problems. The final one of these was a proposal to his longtime friend Sophia Ryde, perhaps the closest thing to a girlfriend the virtually asexual Nick ever had. We'll hear a little more about her later.
Which will you go for?
Which Will, the next song, is structured as a series of rhetorical questions that could be related to love or simply life in general. Honestly, this is the least interesting song on Pink Moon to me, so I'm going to gloss over it somewhat. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just a very simple song that doesn't do anything unique for me to dig into much here. Trevor Dan, in his book, says that Which Will uses a totally unique tuning for Nick. But this is only technically true. It's really just the Nick Drake tuning, but a semitone lower than he usually played it. Two songs on the record, the previously discussed Place to Be and Free Ride, which comes a little later, do genuinely have completely unique tunings. Horn is not only the starkest and simplest song on Pink Moon, but the starkest and simplest of Nick Drake's entire career. This sparse nature has been often noted by critics. Richard Morton Jack says that its power and beauty lie in its restraint. Amanda Petricic described it as nauseatingly spare. This doesn't, however, stop it from being one of the most interesting songs on the album. It is both Pink Moon's only instrumental track and, at 1 minute and 21 seconds, the shortest song by quite a way. The piece opens with a bar of simply D and then enters into a figure of dotted rhythms and minims, while slowly moving down the octave in the melody, holding a D in the bass. It's especially stark when the dissonances are allowed to shine through, such as the second bar where the C sharp and D sit uncomfortably together. Apart from the low A, the whole song is played on just two strings and in standard tuning. Really, you could play this on guitar with absolutely no experience or instruction beforehand, an oddity for Nick's usually fairly demanding fingerpicking style. Trevor Dan hypothesises that Nick found his inspiration for the song when travelling Morocco before he attended Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, though it's difficult to tell exactly what he means here without greater detail. The guitar that Nick plays on this is of some debate. John Wood is adamant that this was recorded on some kind of steel string guitar, like the rest of the album, and it's not my place to tell him his business or what happened in a room that he was literally in, but I cannot get my head around this guitar being a steel string acoustic guitar. Nick notoriously played with very dead strings, which gives a flatter, almost woodier rather than metallic sound out of the guitar, which could go some way in explaining the tone, but the guitar on Horn sounds so fundamentally different to the rest of the record that I feel like he must have used a nylon string guitar, or at least a different one. But this brings up a bigger question. What guitar did Nick actually play on the record? Many people have said that Nick played a small-bodied Guild M20, including Scott Apple in a 1998 article, and Amanda Petricic in her 2007 book on Pink Moon. Richard Morton Jack's interview with John Wood recalls Nick playing a Martyn D28, though this is the same interview that sees Wood refuse that any nylon strings could have been used. There's a lot of stuff online and in writings about exactly what guitar Nick played on the record. I generally err towards Morton Jack's version, but to be perfectly honest, I'm not that interested in any of the tiny details on tone, and there's plenty of stuff online if you are interested. Since we're talking about his tone, let's discuss the actual recording of Pink Moon in a little more detail. As I said, the whole thing was done in just 2 nights by 2 people, but the simplicity of Pink Moon obscures the nature of its very professional recording. People have this view of Pink Moon that it's then almost a home recording, done DIY by this distant and mysterious singer. But it's a very well-produced record. Even though it sounds like a simple recording, it wasn't just a case of sticking a microphone under his nose and pressing the start and stop buttons. There were 2 mics on his guitar, 2 room mics, and a separate vocal mic, and it was recorded onto a 16-track machine, so fairly elaborate. To compensate for the fact that it was just guitar and voice, I wanted the recording to have a larger-than-life immediacy and presence, to draw the listener into it. Nick had been floating the idea of doing a much sparser record for some time, though he still wanted Wood on board. As Trevor Dann puts it, John Wood did more than anyone to create the Nick Drake sound, and without his presence it would likely sound like an even more different record to his other two outings. Despite Nick spurning offers of friendship and professional collaboration from other friends and colleagues, Nick had stayed in fairly regular contact with John Wood during the first few months of his depression, making him one of Nick's last friends in London as he grew increasingly isolated. John grew more worried about Nick during the recording of the record. He could see that he wasn't in good shape, but there was little time for small talk with only 6 total hours to work on the record. No song took more than 2 or 3 takes, and Nick was characteristically perfect in performance. Nick sat on a chair on the studio floor whilst John sat behind on the desk, mostly with his head down on the monitors. Aside from the 11 songs that ended up on the finished record, Nick played a version of the French tune Plaisir d'amour, and another unheard track. They debated including the cover on the album, which would have been the only cover Nick Drake ever put out on any of his records, but ultimately decided against it. I think that was the right decision, personally, as it sounds very different and would subtract somewhat from the intensely personal and individual nature of the record. Nick returned to the studio Sound Techniques that Saturday, October 30th, 1971, to finish up the album. This mixing stage of the record was fairly simple, being 99% just guitar and voice. John Wood said that Nick would stare at the wall and say that he didn't want anything else added. Once some cursory mixing had been done and a track order had been decided on, Pink Moon was ready. In one of his only interviews, Nick stated that he self-produced the album. Knowing Nick's temperament, John kept the master tape of the album, just in case.
Please beware of them that stare, they'll only smile to see while you die.
Things Behind the Sun was probably the first song written for Pink Moon. Nick played it for his friend David Ward as early as the summer of 1969, just after 5 Leaves Left was released. Among other times, Nick would play the song at his gig at the Royal Festival Hall in September 1969, which went down very well with the crowd. It was even singled out in the Record Mirror's review of the gig for special praise. That gig was probably the peak of Nick's live career, and whilst he did seem, on some level, to enjoy the rush he got from performing on stage, it was not worth the mental effort it took him to get up there. Besides, Nick wasn't particularly suited to being a stage act. His songs are intimate, quiet experiences, suited best to listening on record. This is especially true considering Nick performed alone, sans all the backing provided by Joe Boyd on the records. This combined badly with Nick's shyness. Playing this kind of folk acoustic guitar requires a significant amount of retuning and string breaking, as I'm sure you've noticed with how much I've been talking about different tunings. Where a charismatic performer like John Martyn was able to keep the crowd entertained through his bantering personality during these breaks, Nick was quiet and awkward on stage. The song also made an appearance at one of Nick's gigs on August the 1st, 1970, and he didn't know it then, but it would be the last time he ever performed live, making his whole live career somewhere between just 10 and 20 performances. As he put it in one of the only interviews he ever gave, there were only 2 or 3 concerts that felt right, and there was something wrong with all the others. If I was enjoying the gigs, it would have made much more sense. In a 1986 interview, 12 years after Nick's death, John Martyn said that he felt that it was costing Nick too much to go on stage, that no matter the amount of applause, it would never repay the energy it depleted from him. Things Behind the Sun is largely based around C-sharp minor, with occasional movements to the dominant chord of G-sharp and lots of suspended chords dotted about in typical Nick Drake fashion. Like Horn before it, the song is a rare example of standard tuning on Pink Moon, yet is also probably the most different to Horn on the album. It's the wordiest song of all, and the only song unequivocally more interesting for its lyrical content than its musical content. Look here on the lyrics on the record. The song's words take up way more space than any other on the album. Where Horn was the shortest song on the album, Things Behind the Sun is the longest, clocking in at 3 minutes and 54 seconds. Lyrically, it's about people staying true to themselves, with a surprisingly optimistic message for Pink Moon, though some people think it's about death and some about drugs. Its optimism perhaps stems from the fact Nick finished it so much earlier. On the other hand, it requires a suspicious and paranoid view of people in the first place to need this virtual mantra to repeat to himself. Though it had been played earlier, Nick constantly told Joe Boyd that the song was unfinished, so it's difficult to tell which parts, like lyrics, were changed later on. This is probably as good a time as any to talk about Joe Boyd in a little more detail. I've mentioned him a couple of times now. From Princeton, New Jersey, Boyd moved to London after graduating from Harvard in 1964 and became something of an impresario for London's underground music scene, especially in the psychedelic and folk areas. In this era, he's best known for two things: founding the UFO Club that served as the heart of London's psychedelic world, and founding Witch Season Productions, the production company that had much of London's folk world on its roster. Named after the Donovan song Season of the Witch, his artists included Fairport Convention, John Martyn, the Incredible String Band, and, eventually, Nick. Nick was on the bill at a charity gig at the Roundhouse in Camden, and Ashley Hutchings of Fairport Convention watched Nick play, and impressed, recommended him to Joe. Though Joe wasn't too impressed with the first song he heard on Nick's demo tape, Magic.
But you all lost that magic many years ago.
He was blown away by the next set of songs, and Nick was quickly added to Joe's roster. Joe, and Chris Blackwell of Island Records, Nick's label, went to great ends for Nick, far more than they did for the rest of their artists, and more than virtually any other producer or executive would do for their musicians, especially for an unknown artist like Nick. Nick's second album, and the one preceding Pink Moon, Brighter Later, featured a host of embellishments to broaden its commercial appeal after Five Leaves Left failed to sell. Despite its more accessible nature, Brighter Later is, in my opinion anyway, the weakest of Nick's three albums. It's still great, but next to Five Leaves Left and Pink Moon, it doesn't have the same timeless quality they do. It feels like a record from the early 1970s. Nick hadn't been enthusiastic about the garnish added to his songs on Brighter Later, and told Joe that the next record would be only guitar and voice, something Joe took as a criticism. Nick's poor stage presence and reluctance to conduct interviews, barely speaking on the few occasions he did, certainly didn't help either. It was possible to make a singer-songwriter career with minimal gigging, and Leonard Cohen served as a good model for how to do it, but not doing interviews or gigs signalled the death knell for any record. But there was another reason that Brighter Later failed. It was released in March 1971, and 6 weeks previously, Joe Boyd had boarded a flight to Los Angeles to start a new job there, leaving Nick's album to be released without his guiding hand, and allowing it to slip through the cracks a little. But Joe leaving London had a deeper impact on Nick than merely Brighter Later's sales figures. Though only 6 years Nick's senior, Joe had been something of a protector to Nick, being acutely aware of his artistic temperament and sensitivities. Trevor Dan calls the Boyd-Drake relationship that of a surrogate father, but this probably mischaracterises their relationship somewhat. They didn't really spend any time together outside of working, and when they did, the discussion would mostly be about work. But Nick had a tremendous amount of respect for Joe, and became even more lost and alone without his guiding hand. Even Nick's actual father, Rodney, noted the impact that Joe had on him. He noted how upset and abandoned Nick felt by Joe's move to America, and when Nick was in the depths of his mental decline, his parents implored Joe to speak to Nick about getting help, since he was the person Nick respected most, which Joe obliged. Pink Moon is the only one of Nick's records that doesn't list Joe Boyd as its producer, and he didn't hear about the record at all until he received a finished copy. Of the record, Joe said, "When I saw the cover I was horrified, and when I played it I was even more horrified. I interpreted its starkness as a rebuke to me. I thought it was self-destructive, a capitulation, as if he was saying, 'Fuck it, I don't care whether people listen to it or not. I listened to it once.'"
I don't care.
Behind Horn, the next song, No, is probably the simplest song on the album, built around a very simple guitar pattern, with just 22 words in the lyrics and 13 unique words. It's seemingly about the host of family, friends and colleagues that would do anything for Nick, but that he wouldn't or couldn't let them in. Near the start of his breakdown, Nick's family got in contact with Island Records, only to find that they were willing to give him anything to get some music out of him. It surprised his family to find that it wasn't a lack of professional opportunity that was contributing to Nick's decline. When Nick sings "You Know That I See You, You Know I'm Not There," it likely relates to his habit of attending places or events and simply not saying anything. Friends recall one instance of him attending a gathering of people that he hadn't seen for some time, and then being shocked by how much of a shell he seemed. standing in the corner alone, seeing them but not being there. Great swathes of the song are hummed before Nick musters the energy to even sing those few lines. Psychiatrist Donna Anderson, writing about Nick in the 90s, sees the song as an expression of emotional numbness, Nick feeling uncomfortable and confused with the world around him. Richard Morton Jack has also seen it as a kind of unrequited love song, which is also fair. Many critics have drawn similarities between No and the Doors' Roadhouse Blues, released around the time that Pink Moon was being written. Nick was known to be a fan of the Doors, attending their September 1968 concert at London's Roundhouse, and the songs are certainly similar, based on a virtually identical swung E-blues riff. Of course, it's possible that Roadhouse Blues was an inspiration for Nick, but it's probably got more to do with Nick's love of the blues in general, something that friend Robert Kirby said was a pity more people didn't get to hear on record.
Oh, Black Mountain, try to spit in your face.
Besides, it's so simple that it's not unimaginable that two musicians would have played it independently. There's probably a million songs that sound just like this. Besides, as Amanda Petrich has pointed out, focusing on the similarity of the riffs obscures the huge difference in tone between Jim Morrison's wild, sexually charged wails and Nick's low-key, resigned performance.
For I am the parasite of this town.
Parasite, the next song, is the first song I learnt to play on guitar from the album, and probably my favourite, all things considered. Earlier I mentioned that Place to Be is the only song on the album not to be in 4/4 time, depending on how you count this song. Lots of places have it listed as a dotted rhythm in 6/8, but I have it here as a swung rhythm in 4/4. I mean, you can count anything in 4/4 if you're committed enough, but that's just how I hear it. It's built around this descending passage in the Nick Drake tuning, and these descending passages are actually fairly common in Nick's work generally, but surprisingly rare on this album. Introduction on Brighter Later, for instance, is based on a pattern that's almost identical to that in Parasite, except it uses a different style of fingerpicking and replaces the added flat 13 in the third bar with an added natural fourth, which gives Parasite a much harsher sound in its third bar, rather than the gentle dissonance between F sharp and G in Introduction. Other songs on Brighter Later, such as At the Chime of a City Clock, are also built around these kind of descending passages in the same tuning. The verses are based around an E flat with one note changing, descending chromatically from the flat 7 of D flat down to the 5th of B flat.
Lifting the mask from a local clown, feeling down like him.
The refrain's chords are quite interesting too. In essence, they're F flat major 7 and E flat, but there's a few ways of thinking about them. One could think about it as a Neapolitan chord, or a chord built from the flattened second degree of the scale. In E flat, this would be F flat.
Take a look, you may see me on the ground.
But mostly Neapolitan chords are found in minor keys, unlike the E flat major of Parasite, and in its traditional sense, it would be in first inversion, whereas here it's in root position, and it would also normally prepare the dominant chord, rather than skipping straight to the tonic. You could also think about it in terms of modes. Most of the song is in E flat mixolydian, whereas this borrows the flat 2 chord from E flat phrygian. The way Nick plays it, it has very smooth voice leading, with the root and 5th, the F flat and C flat, going down a semitone to E flat and B flat, the top note staying the same on E flat, and the A flat shifting up a step to B flat. However you think about it, this flat 2 chord has the subdominant function, and the semitone fall from the C flat to B flat is similar to the sound of a minor plagal cadence. In all honesty, and this probably matters more than anything, talking about Nick's harmony is almost futile in a traditional sense, since it's so reliant on the tunings and unusual voicings. Nick's singing is pretty melodically simple, though rhythmically clashes with the guitar part beautifully. In the chorus, it's a little more complicated as it follows the aforementioned chords pretty closely. Along with Things Behind the Sun, Parasite is the only other song on Pink Moon to have been composed primarily pre-breakdown. It touches on urban alienation, a theme explored in At the Chime of a City Clock on Brighter Later, where Nick sings, "The games you play make people say you're either weird or lonely. A city star won't shine too far on account of the way you are.
Games you play make people say you're either weird or lovely.
It was probably written in the same frame of mind and time frame that Parasite was written in, and it's not clear to what extent the song is autobiographical, because there is no obvious host for him to be parasitic from. If anything, he was fiercely independent to a fault. The description of sailing downstairs to the Northern Line is probably about Chalk Farm underground station near Danehurst, the house which contained his small bedsit on Haverstock Hill. Nick's description of falling so far on a silver spoon is likely reflective of his feeling of failure despite his privileged upbringing, a public school and Cambridge education and colonial family. Also, Parasite contains quite a few of the objects displayed on Pink Moon's album cover: the local clown, the shoe, and the rope. This is as good a time as any to talk about the artwork in a little more detail. It looks wildly different from Nick's first two albums, which both feature stark colours, green and purple respectively, and images of Nick, taken by photographers Keith Morris and Nigel Weymouth. Island's art director, Annie Sullivan, was placed in charge of overseeing the artwork for the album, but in her awkward meetings with Nick, he was essentially mute. All he managed to give her was the album's title, not much to go on. Originally, Island was going to use pictures of Nick, taken by Morris, but the pictures ended up reflecting Nick's sad deterioration too much, so they went back to the drawing board. Morris said that Nick looked like a tramp, and the overwhelming colour of the day felt grey. If the photos hadn't been in black and white, Morris said, they would still look the same. Sullivan commissioned surrealist painter Michael Trevithick to create the artwork, and despite him only having one album cover under his belt, Tobacco Road by Spooky Touch, it was his painting that would ultimately be used on the front and back covers of the album. He completed the artwork without ever hearing the record, though he did listen to Brighter later and have access to the lyrics, which inspired many of the images on the cover. The flower, hill, deepest sea, local clown, shoes, rope, broken cup, etc. A couple of other things, like the rocket and cheese, were just added, as he put it, for fun.
All of the pictures that you keep on the wall, all of the...
The anti-penultimate song, Free Ride, is long speculated to be a reference to Sophia Ride, as I mentioned earlier, the closest Nick ever had to a girlfriend. He never really had what you would call a girlfriend, though seemed to harbour a special affinity for Sophia. They met when Nick based himself at his sister's flat in London, and Sophia was one of the circle that he immersed himself in during his more sociable days. Exactly a month older than Nick, friends described her as shy, yet strong and well-liked. She sounds a little like Nick himself. She never found him overly shy or anything in those early days, just completely normal. The group of them holidayed together, such as in Scotland over the Easter of 1968, and attended gigs together, including Bob Dylan at the Isle of Wight Festival and the Doors gig I mentioned earlier. Their relationship grew more complex as Nick's decline continued. There was one night when a non-verbal Nick arrived unannounced at her house when her new boyfriend was round, and it being particularly awkward. She never had any inkling, as she put it, that Nick harboured any particular feelings towards her until she and her boyfriend split up and Nick would come round more often, though he never said anything. This culminated in his panicked and ill-thought-through proposal that I mentioned earlier when talking about Road. Of course, the name of the song, Free Ride, could reference her with the Y in her name swapped in for an I. He did this on Brighter Later, probably as a little tribute to John Martyn, whose stage name was taken after the brand of guitar, but with the I switched out for a Y. Trevor Dan says that Sophia kept a lot of post-impressionist pictures on the wall, as mentioned in the lyrics of Free Ride, though this is something that Richard Morton Jack's interviews with Sophia can test. As with most cases where they clash, I'd trust Morton Jack's biography over Dan's. The song is in C Mixolydian, creating something of a pattern on Pink Moon, which is a very Mixolydian album overall. And the tuning for this one is quite unique. Standard tuning, but with the third string dropped down to an E and the sixth string dropped down to an A. With a capo on the third fret, this tunes the song to C, C, F, G, D, G, the only time Nick ever used this pretty unique sounding tuning. Harmonically, it's very typical of the album, with lots of suspended chords around. It does have a little more bluesy influence in the presence of the flat sixth in the guitar and vocals.
All of the pictures that you keep on the wall, all of the people that will come to the bone.
Lyrically, the you could be referring to Sophia herself, though the whole album uses the second person quite a lot, which is probably just about people in general and Nick's increasing feeling of disconnection from the world. A little like Parasite, Getting a free ride contains the theme of leeching off other people and being uncomfortable with the comforts afforded to him in life. Again, perhaps his feelings of failing to live up to his privilege.
Falling fast and falling free, you look too fine.
The next, and second to last song, is another very short number, Harvest Breed. The chord progression here is quite unique, going E flat diminished add 11, E flat add 11, A flat minor, F minor 7. A really interesting and unique sound that is enabled by one of Nick Drake's other favourite tunings. Tuning his guitar B, E, B, E, B, E with his capo on the 4th fret, Harvest Breed is tuned to E flat, A flat, E flat, A flat, E flat, A flat. Something used on a lot of Nick Drake's songs, especially on Brighter Later, where 4 songs, At the Chime of a City Clock, Fly, Northern Sky and Sunday, all use this tuning. The rhythms of the song are also quite interesting. Lots of places have the beginning of the bar notated on what is actually the upbeat, and there is some nice syncopation in the guitar part just before the vocals enter. Like No, the song consists of only a few lyrics about falling fast and falling free. It's widely interpreted to be about death, and is kind of the album's finale, with From the Morning being an epilogue. If the pink moon symbolises spring and rebirth after death, the harvest is autumnal, wilting, and ultimately dying. It's not out and out bleak like some of the songs. If anything, it's accepting and relaxed, but it is almost prophetic of Nick's own death.
Falling fast and falling free, you look to find a friend.
Paul Wheeler, one of Nick's closest friends, sees Harvest Breed as being essential to understanding Nick's state of mind in this period.
And it was beautiful.
The final song of Nick Drake's 3-album output, From the Morning, seems an uncharacteristically positive presence on an otherwise gloomy and downcast record. This was not something unnoticed by his family and friends. His father Rodney felt rather mystified by the music on Pink Moon, except for From the Morning, which he and Nick's mother Molly both loved. It's fitting then that Nick was buried with the lines, "Now we rise and we are everywhere," inscribed on the back of his headstone in his hometown of Tamworth in Arden.
Now we rise, we are everywhere.
Upon their respective deaths in 1998 and 1993, Rodney and Molly Drake were added to the same headstone. Rather than lamenting the world, as much of the record does, it celebrates the beauty of a new dawning day, the inverse of the references to Day is Done on previous parts of the album. Endless colours, games, flying, rising from the ground, a beautiful day, endless summer nights. It's a really nice ending, and it's a shame Nick himself was not afforded the same. But, as is often the case with mentally ill people, and as outlined in several psychoanalyses of Nick, suicidal people suddenly see an upswing before their death as they are no longer wrestling with the decision. Musically, it's very simple, being in the same tuning as the previous song, but with the capo only on the 1st fret. It's fairly fast, containing a lot of semiquavers that give it a jaunty nature that's not so present on the rest of the album. There's virtually no melisma on the vocals of the record, which has its melodies and rhythms largely dictated by its lyrics rather than the other way around, apart from on this song. It's only small, but words like learned are stretched across several bars and several notes.
That you learned from the morning.
And just like that, Pink Moon is over. But only 2 people knew that, Nick Drake and John Wood. None of Nick's friends and family knew that he had made a new album, though most were more concerned about his mental state than worrying about new music. In fact, Nick hadn't even told those at Island Records that he was working on a new record, and simply was relying on a gentleman's agreement he had with Chris Blackwell from the year prior about upfront payment. On Monday, November 1st, 1971, less than a week after first walking into the studio, Nick headed to Island's London offices at Basing Street, told the receptionist who he was, and waited to be invited upstairs by someone he knew there. David Sanderson, Island's press officer, made him a couple of cups of tea whilst Nick sat in silence. Chris Blackwell, the head of Island Records, came in and Nick was paid his £500, around £6,000 or $8,000 today, and left, unsurprisingly without a word. The half-hour encounter had a profound effect on Blackwell, who was saddened to see the state that Nick was in. After he left, Chris rang up John Wood to ask about it, and John corroborated that it was, indeed, Nick Drake's new album. It would be the last time that David, Chris, or anyone at Island Records saw Nick Drake. Blindsided and surprised by the album, Island Records took an unusual approach to promoting a most unusual artist by emphasising Nick's poor sales and aloof personality. Penned by Sanderson, the press release reads, "Nobody at Island is really sure where Nick lives these days. We're pretty sure he left his flat in Hampstead quite a while ago. We have a bank agreement for him so that he's always got his rent money and some spending bread. The chances of Nick actually playing in public are more than remote. So why, when there are people prepared to do anything for a recording contract or a Queen Elizabeth Hall date, we're releasing this new Nick Drake album, and the next, if he wants to do one? Because we believe that Nick Drake is a great talent. His first 2 albums haven't sold a shit, but if we carry on releasing them, then maybe one day someone in authority will stop to listen to them properly and agree with us, and maybe a lot more people will get to hear Nick Drake's incredible songs and guitar playing. And maybe they'll buy a lot of records and fulfill our faith in Nick's promise. Then we'll have done our job." Another candid press release summarised the record as Nick Drake's latest album. The first we heard of it was when it was finished. Unfortunately, much like Five Leaves Left and Brighter Later, Island was shouting into the void trying to promote Nick Drake. Nobody cared. When released on February 25th, 1972, it generated only a tiny amount more attention than his previous efforts, receiving a few short reviews and little more. As with Brighter Later, it was released in ill-fated circumstances. Pink Moon was released into England during the miners' strike and severe power cuts. It was a politically turbulent time that a quiet, introspective folk record didn't particularly suit. And if you did want that kind of music, you were already spoilt for choice in the early 1970s. Leonard Cohen's brilliant record Songs of Love and Hate was less than a year old, and Joni Mitchell's landmark album Blue was only a few months old. Most contemporary critics that did give Pink Moon attention liked it. Melody Maker called Nick a fairly mysterious person and a cult figure, and that the more you listen to Drake, the more compelling his music becomes, but all the time it hides from you. Best, a French magazine, astutely noted that Nick could be as famous as some of the greatest names of the genre, if only he were willing, and called the record extraordinary. Record Mirror liked it, as did Record Retailer and Time Out, but all the reviews were short. Pink Moon was Nick's only album to get an American release during his lifetime, being released in May 1972, and it generated equally positive but minimal attention there. It wasn't universally praised. Sounds and the Reading Evening Post gave it more critical assessments, but it didn't seem to provoke much of a reaction anywhere. Nick's friends, generally speaking, found it disturbing. One called it music to commit suicide to, another dark and depressing, another incredibly upsetting and appalling. His fellow musicians too knew it was the end of something. Beverly Martyn, John's then wife and a great singer-songwriter in her own right, knew that it was the product of a sick person. Richard Thompson had always loved Nick's music for its balance of light and dark, but found Pink Moon to have no light left. Robert Kirby, one of Nick's Cambridge friends and the arranger for Five Leaves Left, apart from Riverman, evolved his views on the album over the years. Initially he called it his favourite album of Nick's, but has gradually come to see it as an unfinished project, released too soon so Nick could shed the weight of his masterpieces. He later said that he feels guilty listening to it, likening the record to a public execution. So that's Pink Moon. Introspective, haunting, and beautiful, its renewed critical and commercial reception, in no small part to a Volkswagen advert propelling Nick to posthumous stardom,
Pink, 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 pink.
has catapulted the album into the canon of great folk music in particular, and all music in general. It's listed as the 36th highest rated album on Rate Your Music as of writing. Not bad for an album that generated such little attention on its release. If you like this video, please do leave a like, share it, subscribe. Best of all, leave a comment, because I always love hearing what you all have to say about the music that I talk about. If you enjoyed this, maybe you'll like some of my other videos on similar artists like Leonard Cohen, and hopefully I'll see you next time.